There's this beautiful line that John Paul has in one of his documents where more or less what he says is, the church wishes to be loved by the celibate priest in the way that Jesus Christ, her bridegroom, loves her.
Welcome, everybody. We're here today with Father Carter Griffin. Father Carter is the rector of the seminary, St. John Paul II Seminary here in Washington, D.C. It's snowing here in D.C. It seems like the weather's a little chilly.
First time in 8 years, I'm told, in December.
Really?
Yeah, first time in 8 years we had December snow.
Wow. I remember coming down for the march.
We're thrilled.
I remember coming down for the march, and it was always snowing.
Oh, really?
And, mid-January, but March for Life. But yeah, that's interesting. Cool. So how are you, Father?
Doing great. Thanks for asking. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And our viewers love to hear the stories about where the priests that studied at Santa Croce are now and what they're doing.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself for those who may not know you or of your work?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up, I was actually born in New York, in Rochester, although my family's all from the South, from North Carolina and Georgia. But we moved abroad when I was very young. So my dad was in international business when I was 4. And we bounced around country to country, mainly in Latin America. So that's kind of actually part of the story because we weren't Catholic. I wasn't Catholic. And we were basically in Catholic countries. So a lot of my friends were Catholic. And I had a pretty positive experience of my friends who were Catholic and people who worked in the home with us and things like that. So anyway, moved around a lot, went to boarding school in England, came back for college in the States. From college, and when I was in college, it was in New Jersey in Princeton, and so a friend of mine was a faithful Catholic, and I was kind of interested in this Catholic girl that I was sort of dating, but she was a good ways away at a different university, and visiting her one time, and then driving back, it was a long drive back, I remember thinking that I need to kind of figure out this kind of God question, and I had experience as a kind of mainline Protestant, I suppose, went to church on Sundays, but we wouldn't have called ourselves like a fervent Christian family, but decent people, the kind of the mold, right? And so I was disposed to receive that grace, which by the grace of God I did receive. But so I went to this friend of mine who I knew went to Catholic Mass, and we went to his priest, and I had a lot of questions for him, read a lot of books, and eventually came into the church when I was 21 years old.
Oh, wow.
Then I had my senior year, and then I went to the Navy for 4 years. So that's kind of a big part of my story. My growth was in the Navy, and then from there, I was discerning the priesthood the whole time. Went into the seminary, was ordained for the Archdiocese of Washington, and then went back a couple years later to do my doctorate, and that's when I went to Santa Croce. So for me, it was the experience of the doctorate a little bit later, and that's had a huge impact on my own way of thinking. My dissertation was on on priestly celibacy, which ended up later on becoming a book at a time when there was a lot of confusion about celibacy and the importance of celibacy and things like that, especially if you remember around the time of the Amazon Synod in 2018. So I got to know Scott Hahn actually when I was doing my doctorate there in Rome, and he and I stayed in touch, and at one point he just said, like, you gotta do the book, because it's like there was just a lot of people wondering, like, why do we even have this thing anymore?
Wow.
Why is anyone celibate? What's the point? Anyway, so that was kind of and I've been basically here, so I've been ordained 21 years, but 15 of them have been here at the seminary. So I was vice rector and now rector. So it's been most of my priesthood, I'd say, have been in priestly formation.
So why is celibacy important, especially for the priesthood?
Yeah, well, there's kind of like the really quick and the middle and the really long answer, but I would say the really quick answer, the way, sort of the elevator conversation I like to say is, it's a privileged way of living spiritual fatherhood, right? That it is fundamentally about having yourself, not just in terms of time, that's not unimportant, but primarily your emotional and even your spiritual space open for just an awful lot of people, right? I mean, our Lord himself remained celibate, not because he was unable to marry, but just because his mission sort of demanded it. And I think that celibacy is so closely tied to the priesthood and other forms of radical service to the church, right? Including religious life and others. But that it is his way of living a kind of a completeness for the Lord and for the apostolic mission that he gives us. In the case of the diocesan priest especially, it's ordered, I think, in the reason that Jesus speaks about celibacy in the Gospels is that it's not for everyone to receive it, but for those, it's for the sake of the kingdom of God, right? For their service to the kingdom of God. It's not because It's not primarily because it somehow will make me holier, except in as much as it helps me live out my mission to the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So for the diocesan priesthood, it's especially focused on serving souls, saving souls and serving souls. You could say that there might be a slightly different emphasis in religious life in particular, where it has what's sometimes called like the eschatological witness of celibacy, is to say that it sort of points us to kind of a world beyond, right? So people are living without marriage, without the pleasures of marriage and family life and children, is also kind of a reminder to all of us that this is not the only life that there is. In fact, there's a whole lot more to come. So there's kind of that witness. I think those would be the ones I would focus on. There are actually a lot of other reasons too. But fundamentally, I would say that if the church were to diminish or eliminate celibacy altogether, especially for parish priests, which is what folks tend to be talking about. They're not saying normally like monks should be married in a monastery. They're not even necessarily saying that bishops should be married.
Yeah.
They're kind of actually referring to something that in fact has become the practice in much of the Eastern Church, right? The Orthodox churches, where parish priests, that parish priests can often be married. And I think the answer to us would be, we could go that route someday, but it would be a great impoverishing, to the church. There's a lot of struggles that go along with celibacy. There always have been, right? There was a period in the 9th and 10th century where, there were so many voices to get rid of celibacy because there's a lot of, to be honest, a lot of child abuse. There was a lot of having concubines and, all these sort of stuff. And then it got really bad again in the 15th century and, 16th century. So there are these periods of time where there's just a lot of calls saying, we can't do this, like this is inhuman, whatever. And the church over and over again has said, no, the answer is reform, right? The answer is to do it properly, right? I like to say that, because a lot of times behind that question is not just priests are really stretched. We need to talk about that. But a lot of times it's really, is there something unhealthy or unnatural about this? And then it might even point to the sex abuse crisis and things like that. And I like to say to that, I say, well, those were clearly celibate priests for the most part that were doing that. But we all know, first of all, that by far the most abuse that happens is not by celibate priests, but by married people, And the answer to abuses in marriage or corruption in marriage is to reform marriage and have people live more faithfully their married vows. Yeah. The answer to problems in celibate priesthood is to reform the priesthood and have people live more faithfully their celibacy. Yeah. And when they do, there's an extraordinary joy. There's a great gift to the people of God. So could it change one day? It could. I'm not in control of that. It's not something that is, there obviously are married priests out there, right? So it's not impossible for it to happen. But I think it would be a great loss to the church and to the people of God and to the priests themselves. I think for whom lived well, celibacy is an enormous gift.
Yeah. That's incredible. What about people who say, well, this is the answer to the priest shortage. If we allowed married men to be ordained, we could ordain every deacon or something like that, or many faithful men who have many children, that kind of thing.
Right. Couple things there. The first thing is I sort of question the premise. I'm just not sure that it would be such a great. There might be a brief kind of blip, but if the experience of many of the separated, of the Protestant communions, if they're any example, frankly, even Eastern Rite Catholics, certainly Orthodox, they're all having a lot of difficulties with recruiting, even though they have married parish priests. Interesting, at the time of the Amazon Synod, I think it was the Ukrainian Catholic Church patriarch said, basically, I'm going to paraphrase now, but he basically said, slow down, because we have problems, this is not going to be the answer, right? The answer is not just kind of go for the quick fix and then say, well, now we have no more problems with priesthood, and it's just not going to happen that way. So that's the first thing, and that's kind of the most practical. The second thing, frankly, of a more important, for me, the more important response to that is to say that, what I believe the right reading of history, and I think it's scholars that would back this up, is that, the changes that happened in the Orthodox Church in the 8th century were a change from the apostolic norm. The apostolic norm wasn't necessarily all celibacy, but it was certainly perpetual continence within marriage, within priesthood and bishop. And it eventually became it's just much easier to be celibate to begin with, So in a sense, celibacy was an outcropping, but it really began in the apostolic times with an understanding of perpetual continence. That is to say, and the wife would have to agree for her husband to be ordained, because she was giving up her marital rights right at that time. It's very rare for a woman to have to agree to anything back then for a man to do, but the church insisted, because she's giving up some of her marital rights. So, if that's kind of the norm, and the Orthodox Church has sort of changed that, policy later on, we sort of let's look at whether that's been kind of a net, benefit. In many ways, it has been for them. But what would happen, because the bishops would remain celibate, right? I think there's no question about that.
Right.
That's true in the Orthodox, Eastern rites, everything. So the bishops remain celibate. So put it this way, here at JP2 Seminary or at another seminary, guys come into the seminary. Now, we're not going to have guys dating in the seminary, right? So, and no Eastern Church, no Orthodox Church, that, right? So what happens is you essentially, now in the Orthodox Church it makes sense because the bishops are basically all drawn from the monasteries who are celibate anyway. We could do that perhaps, but you'd have a very small pool, right, in the West. And so you're going to have guys who are on this kind of two-track, the celibate track and a non-celibate track. Now, why is a guy on the celibate track? Okay, allow your mind to go like where that goes. It might be because he's very holy and the Lord has called him into this beautiful kind of expression of living for the kingdom of God. It might be because he's not interested in marriage anyway, and it might be because he wants to be a bishop, And so, think about what that does for seminary formation. Maybe I'm being a little bit too blunt here for something so public, but I honestly believe that we have to think through the implications rather than, why not just ordain married guys? It's just the easiest thing in the world. There would be consequences we have to be very careful about looking down the road. And I know many married men who are priests, and some exceptional priests out there. There's no question about the capacity for a man. Much better than I'm doing the job. But that's not an issue. It's similar. It's not the same thing, but where the women could be priests. I know many women would be amazing priests, in so many ways. It's not a question of the skills or the capacity. It's a question of what is it that the Lord, because it's the Lord's work.
Yes.
And he's going to work, and there's never going to be enough priests, as it were. And so it's how he decides to work through men who are able to represent him as the bridegroom of the church, and to do so in this completely beautiful kind of all-encompassing way, which is celibacy. There's this beautiful line that John Paul has in one of his documents where more or less what he says is, the church wishes to be loved by the celibate priest in the way that Jesus Christ, her bridegroom, loves her, right? And then there's a gloss on that from Cardinal Sarah that I love to talk about, where he says, the church wouldn't understand who she is without a celibate priest loving her like Jesus, her bridegroom, loves her, right? And so there's something very powerful in the way that the priest does that, which we don't want to just lightly set aside because we're having a hard time filling a couple of parishes.
Yeah.
The vast majority of the church's history has not been, with 3-4 priests with 8 masses, available, within a 10-minute radius of drive. That's just, it's a beautiful luxury we've had, since the 50s, or 60s, but we're not living that time anymore. We have to all think strategically about getting back to the place where we have the right number of parishes for where the people actually live. And that might mean making some tough changes, especially in places where there are a lot fewer priests.
Yes.
But those changes, once they come, I think we'll see the wisdom of staying true to our tradition.
Yeah, because you can build an incredible community there, even if they're driving in, from a long distance. People in rural areas drive an hour to go to Walmart or to the dentist or to the doctor. And, it's we need to be more okay with doing that drive for Mass, and being part of that community. You talk in your book, you write, actually, a man who cannot live chaste celibacy happily will not be happily married man either. What do you think a robust embrace of celibacy is actually the best preparation for married life?
Yeah. Well, I'd have to hear that quote again, because I'm thinking that it might be the other way around, in the sense that, and maybe I'll tweak it, because what I would say is, if a man is not capable of being married, then he's not capable of embracing priestly celibacy. Right? In other words, I think the virtues of a good, healthy, strong and loving husband and father are essentially the exact same virtues as, a loving, strong, priestly father, right? And so I think in that sense, the fatherhood and even the spousality, the way that they're lived out, they're almost identical virtues. The difference, of course, is that marriage is a natural vocation. We're called to give life through another, and 99% of the time that's through a person, in marriage and generating children. But God has decided to pull some out using those same desires, the desire to give life, the desire to love, the desire to have a family, but to do so in a spiritual family, right? And so it's the kind of the same. It's the same movement, in the man that ends up getting lived out in a different way. And so the virtues that allow that movement to kind of to thrive are the same.
Yeah. You speak movingly about paternal celibacy. Can you share a concrete story about how celibacy has made you a more effective spiritual father?
Sure. Yeah. Gosh, there's a lot. Well, I'll just give the example here at the seminary, right? I mean, so here I am as living. My parish is very small by standard. This year it's 63.
Okay.
And yet that's big for us, because the work that you do in a seminary is just so kind of deep, with each guy. You really are in his life, and we live here as a family together, and oftentimes they're saying things just like in a parish setting. Before this, I was at a parish, and people in marriage prep, for example, will talk about things that they haven't talked with anyone about. Like, I'm not even saying like in confession. This is outside of confession. Confession obviously is one thing, but outside of confession, like and it's a very paternal experience of helping someone through whatever difficult. And that happens all the time here at the seminary. Where you are helping them really grow into the men that God is calling them to be, and that I find to be a profoundly paternal experience. And so if a man, for instance, is struggling with maybe there's something that he brings from his family life or from high school, or something that happened to him, and it's never really been talked about, and he's able to bring it out, and he's worried how it's going to be received, and it's received with reverence and with respect and with acceptance and like the desire to help him. And rarely, usually it's been built up in their mind, and it's it comes out, it's like, that's actually not that big a deal, and it was like 6 years ago, whatever it might be, just some struggles of some kind, or an experience they had with somebody else that a lack of charity, or whatever it is, like something that's just been kind of haunting them. Was I fair in this situation, or whatever? So, or bullying that happened in middle school, or whatever it was, and it just comes out, and then suddenly, like, they're able to receive grace in a new way because there's been this blockage, and when you see that happen in somebody's life, there's really nothing like it. It's an experience of paternity that is sort of second to none. So anyway, it's many stories like that. They're really beautiful.
That's great. What about you've been here for 15 years. What about families that you see these guys coming from? A lot of people ask me just randomly. We have 9 kids, and it's like, well, how do we get our kids to be open to this calling to the priesthood, or how do we form them, in order to prepare them to a life that would be open to that, calling?
Yeah. So one of the things I did recently was a book called Forming Families, Forming Saints. And the idea was like translating the sort of the lessons from the seminary life and even the structure of seminary life into a family setting, And so one of the things in that book is about like building this culture of vocations. And it really is an extension of, the vocation of marriage and the vocation of priesthood. Those are the two sacraments, holy orders and matrimony. Those are the two sacraments ordered to the salvation of souls. Yes. And so primarily in marriage, the salvation of each other's soul, first of all, and then your kids. And then beyond your kids, though, like there's this kind of spreading of the light. And I think that building a culture in which the children are kind of excited about learning what God is calling them to is really an extension of saying, like, my love for you and my desire for your salvation doesn't end with you. It actually goes through you to the people that you in turn will serve, right? So you have these families that are kind of are doing this really well. And I think in conversations with them, one of the big keys is, and one of them, in fact, I had in this book, I just did little like sidebars by families. One of these families, the Morrison family, wrote this beautiful little sidebar in there on how they built this kind of culture of vocation. But a big part of it is sort of an excitement on the part of the parents. It's not anticipating it. It's not kind of living vicariously through your kids. It's like, it's actually being interested. And that requires a supernatural outlook. It requires faith. It requires that sense that, my children each have a vocation. God has called them and has a destiny for them and a beautiful plan for them. I'm convinced of that. And if I'm convinced of that, then my children will be convinced. But it's osmosis. It just happens. Like, I'm kind of curious. I wonder what he's got in store for you, and let's invite over some sisters, so you can meet the sisters, let's invite over people of different professions or whatever, that the children themselves start to catch. And like, I wonder what my vocation is. Yeah. And then there's real freedom in that, and there's a real freedom that the children start to kind of ask questions and start to imagine in their own, mind what they might want to do. And I think it's much easier than kind of like deferring all of those things, all of those questions, all of that experience until kind of some future mythical point where they finish college or whatever, and then like, okay, now go figure out what God is calling you to do. It's like that's unreasonable, because at that point you need to be looking for a job, you're probably looking for a spouse, you're looking, so it needs to happen much earlier. I have this thought of, I don't know if I heard it or if I made it up, I don't know, but 11 and 11, like 11 years old and 11th grade are like two critical turning points.
Yeah.
Right, 11 years old, kind of sort of before puberty, before all those changes, and you're kind of you're kind of able to think, pretty well, but you still haven't kind of got into the, all the maelstrom of that time of life. And so that period of time, a lot of people will look back on that age as a time when they started to really move in a direction towards one of these vocations. And then 11th grade, of course, is a little bit more obvious, perhaps.
Yeah.
But also to help the children to see that vocation to marriage is also a vocation, right? And it's not. I mean, it's true, it's a natural vocation because we're called to that, that's the normal. But then our Lord has lifted that to the level of a sacrament. So that there should be a kind of an excitement around that too.
Yeah.
It's not just kind of like priesthood or religious life and then, okay, I guess you just have the default.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a discernment too.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me what one myth about the priesthood that people hold today that you wish you could snap your fingers and dispel.
Yeah, well, I mean, one for sure would just be that priests are unhappy, that priests are lonely, that they're miserable, that they're kind of overworked. Now, there are priests who are lonely and miserable and overworked. There are an awful lot of lay people who are lonely and miserable and overworked, right? So it's not a question like priesthood or not. But I would say of that, because I mean, every study shows priests being less lonely, happier and just more fulfilled, in their lives. Than lay people, right? So I mean, there's kind of a myth around that. And there's been good studies on that. But the one that I would kind of isolate out in particular is loneliness, right? Because that's obviously a question about celibacy. And I would say, to be sure, first of all, anyone who suggests that celibacy is not going to have a sacrifice, and there's not going to be a cost to that, is trying to sell you something, right? Because of course it is. That's, in a sense, part of the point, right? It's this sacrifice that we make for the sake of greater goods, though. It's not just kind of throwing up your hands and like, well, I'm going to, kind of live a miserable life now, but I guess maybe some people go to heaven because, it's like, no, it's a sacrifice, but it's for the sake of some really beautiful goods that will end up becoming a really meaningful and fulfilled life if you live it well. And if you and by living it well, that just means living it generously. It doesn't mean like you have to have some magic, potion or magic, there's no secret mix. But I think loneliness, the thing that I want to point out about this, because I would say, as I've interviewed like literally hundreds and hundreds of people coming into the seminary, and I'll always ask, like, what questions do you have, any concerns you have, whatever. 9 times out of 10, loneliness comes up, right? Because I mean, that is the impression that people have. And while there are lonely priests out there, I think it's important to remember that loneliness is primarily a state of mind than it is like a physically not. There are a lot of lonely people in cities. There are a lot of lonely people in marriages. There are a lot of loneliness is like part of the human condition. But as an old spiritual director of mine used to say, Father Ron Gellis, I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. He was a priest of Opus Dei in this area, just a wonderful holy man. But anyway, he used to have this line. He used to say that loneliness is a call to prayer. Loneliness is a call to prayer. And that's not just true for priests, it's true for everyone. But like loneliness, this experience of separation, which hopefully doesn't last long, but it's there sometimes. When it is there, like that's an invitation to draw closer to the Lord. And for a celibate priest especially, I think that advice is really important. And just my own experience, that has borne fruit, just that sense of like, okay, that's a little lonely right now, whatever. And you go to, and that's not spiritualizing away something. That's actually a recognition that the most important person in my life is Jesus Christ, right? And that's not just true for celibate priests. But it's something that maybe by living it better ourselves and living it well ourselves, we can hopefully model it for others, because we all have moments like that.
Yeah, for sure. Talking about the guys that you've interviewed, what's one thing that gives you great hope about the young generation today that's coming in, and one thing that maybe keeps you up at night?
Sure, yeah.
Praying over the night.
I think maybe I'll just do 2, because out of the kind of are split evenly in my head for the things that give me most encouragement or hope. The first one is a genuine earnestness, right? There really is just this beautiful desire to serve the Lord. I mean, it's genuine. And coupled with that, the other half of that is fidelity, right? I mean, they just have no interest in kind of creating their own version of the Catholic Church, or sure, they have preferences, we all do, but I really do find them to be, like, I have never had to deal with kind of a rebellious priest who wants to kind of, no, I think the church should teach this about what, X, Y, or Z, which was pretty common, at one time, not that long ago. And so I feel very blessed to be in formation at this time because they're all Catholic, coming in, and they don't always know as much as they think they know.
Yeah.
They have to be kind of, brought along and formed and matured, of course, but there's a real there's an earnestness of a desire to serve, and there is a kind of a beautiful fidelity to the church. I think the area where I worry the most, maybe also kind of a twofold thing. The first one would be, it's just they're products of their culture when it comes to the products of their culture. So when you think about matters of commitment, like having a hard time making a commitment, matters of chastity, anxiety. Things that kind of reflect their generation, scrupulosity sometimes.
Yes.
So all of those things are there, and as good as they are, they've kind of breathed in that air. Usually, occasionally there are families that somehow like, how did you,
live on a farm out in
right, exactly,
Kansas,
right, and so they, but it's beautiful, and when families are able, it's the fact that sort of they're still here. Sometimes I'm just kind of completely in awe of that. Now, many times they are coming from extraordinarily healthy families and backgrounds, and they've been able to be preserved from some of that stuff. But even then, it's still out there.
Yeah.
And so those guys impressed me, obviously, too. But the ones who come really from a lot of brokenness sometimes, and they're here, and there's just like this, like real diamond in the rough kind of pure goodness, in them. It's kind of extraordinary. So that's both is a source of worry, but it's also kind of a source of hope.
Yeah, that's great. What about Santa Croce, turning a little bit? You did your doctorate there. What year was that?
2008 to 2010.
Okay. Good time to be over there.
It was a good time to be over there.
Yeah. Lots going on in Rome.
Right. And so part of the reason why I ended up there is, so I had done my license thesis somewhere else, but I was going to do a topic on, I was actually going to write on St. John of Avila, who has now been made a doctor of the church. I would have been like very famous as a John of Avila, scholar. But anyway, I couldn't find anyone to do, and I sort of read some of it. He was a really interesting guy, Council of Trent, and he was kind of the background for like the treatise on the priesthood with all these council fathers. But he's sort of like one of these background guys. He knew, Ignatius of Loyola, and he knew Teresa of Avila. He knew all these people. That he was a fascinating guy. But anyway, I ended up not finding someone to do that. And at the time, I was talking to Father Bob Gall, who was at Santa Croce, and teaching moral philosophy. He had just done a dissertation, and I knew him from the past.
And he's here at CUA.
He's now at CUA at the Bush School, right? So I just was talking to him one time, and he was saying he was just wrapping up a dissertation with this guy, Timothy Fortin, who's become a good friend, and layman, but he's teaching at a seminary still.
Okay.
Anyway, he did something on how fatherhood is the fulfillment of masculinity from a Thomistic perspective. And so Father Bob and I were talking about the possibility about celibacy. Oh, so what had happened before that, speaking of 2008, 2010, I called a friend of mine, so Pope Benedict had just been elected Pope.
Yes.
And I called a friend of mine, I guess a couple years before, but anyway, I called a friend of mine who had worked with Pope Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger at CDF. Anyway, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So there's this priest friend of mine who had worked with him for like 15 years or something like that. And so I called him, and I said, so I was going to do John of Avila, but I can't find anybody. So, what do you think Pope Benedict would want me to write on? And without hesitation, he said, the theology of celibacy.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just like, he said, absolutely. The Pope talks about it. He's like, there's plenty of stuff on, this is now me interpreting what he was saying, but like there's plenty of stuff on like the canon law or the history or the psychology or this, that, the other thing. But like, why do we have celibacy? Like that is something that hasn't been done a lot of. There's certainly been some and some beautiful stuff. But anyway, so that was the thing. So I was talking to Father Bob about this, and he goes, well, why don't you just do one with me? And this is kind of the follow-up to this guy, Timothy Fortin, who had just done a wonderful dissertation on that. So it was kind of like the theological complement to that.
Yeah.
And kind of theologically, supernaturally, how is supernatural fatherhood, how does a priest order to supernatural fatherhood, and how does celibacy kind of contribute to that? So that was kind of the dissertation, and to my joy, I was able to end up at Santa Croce because I hadn't been able to be there before that for a variety of reasons. But so I took some courses there, which was required as part of the doctoral program, and was and had 2 years back and forth from the Casa where I was living to Santa
Okay,
Croce.
so at the NAC, right? Yeah, the Casa. Great, great. That's awesome. What stood out to you about Santa Croce?
Well, it was my third university. I did one at STB, a different one at STL, and I would say that Santa Croce really stood out as, first of all, just a very professional place. Like it was like there was a just like you knew where you stood. You know, I mean, it was well ordered. I mean, the facilities were great. I mean, it was just a great sense of the. You know, they kind of knew what they were about, sort of thing. And it kind of gives confidence when, especially I'm going in there and like, I really want to try to get this doctorate done in time, and I don't want to have a runaround at things, and I just want to know where I stand. And so that was great. I think that was certainly one element of it. I mean, I think the rigor of the academic rigor was something that stood out to me. It's just like the seriousness of the content in the courses and the fidelity, right? It was just sort of there was no question that what you were going to be receiving was the Catholic faith, right? Sort of unadulterated. And I think that those were some of the things that stood out as really blessings for me when I was doing my doctorate there.
That's great. That's great. What about just living in Rome? How did that shape you were there for 7 years?
7 years, yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did that shape your view of the church? I know it's very important to St. Josemaria Escriva that the priest be formed there in Rome, close to the Holy Father, whoever
So
that
I
may
think
be.
exactly. So the first is just that proximity to the Holy Father, and as you know from St. Josemaria, I mean that was just, and it's not just a kind of an additional teaching. It's not a kind of a flourish. It's not sort of the point of last resort that you go to if you can't figure out an answer to a doctrinal question. It really is the heartbeat of the church, right? And that God chose Rome and not Constantinople and not Moscow and not Washington D.C. and not what it's. This is the scandal of particularity. Like it is in Rome that God willed his vicar to live and to minister from. So that's not nothing, right? The place itself is important. If you think about Old Testament times, place means something, right?
Oh, yeah.
The land and the soil, and like this place has become holy. And so I think the first thing is proximity to the Holy Father, growing in love for the Holy Father. It's not an abstraction, he's not a doctrine, he's a person, and he's a person with a special mission given by God that is a source of great joy for us. So that's one. I think an important one too are the saints that are in Rome, and just being able to go to all the different. I remember when I realized it was our first couple weeks there in our orientation, and we went to St. Lawrence outside the walls. And if you know where St. Lawrence outside the walls is, down there is Pius IX. Now St. Pius IX is down there. I think he's Saint or Blessed. I think he's St. Pius IX. Sure. Anyway, and on the back of that is St. Stephen. And I'm like, St. Stephen, I wonder which St. Stephen this is. And someone's like, St. Stephen from the Acts of the Apostles. I said, only in Rome would the relics of St. Stephen, who is mentioned in the proto-martyr, the first martyr, be in the back of a church not even named for him. To give you a sense of how many saints are in Rome, right? And if you, depending on how you count it up, 6 or 7 apostles, So it's a place of deep, deep holiness.
Yeah.
I think a third reason is the Catholicity of the church, right? Having that experience of all the different people who all call themselves Catholic and are Catholic, right? And that sense that when that they may all be one, as you, Father, and me, and I, like you see that in the church. When my parents came, they were still Protestant. They eventually became Catholic, by the way.
Oh, great.
And when they came the first time, I had told them, I mean, by then you sort of, the lingo, and it was going to be a papal audience. Now, papal audience is John Paul II. Papal audience was in St. Peter's Square with like 40,000 people.
Wow.
I tell my parents, we're going to have a papal audience on Wednesday. They're thinking like tea and toast with John Paul II, a papal audience. And so we show up, and they're like, "When are we going to the audience?" I'm like, "This is the audience," and you're like, the Austrians are like, doing their thing, and like, oh my gosh, it was so embarrassing. But it was actually kind of this great moment, which I don't know, I think began in some ways their conversion. Just because it's an experience of this beautiful Catholicity of the church. And then the last reason I would say maybe kind of the via negativa, or the way that can be a little bit, is that Rome is also a very human place. And if you know the history of Rome, there's been a lot of problems in Rome, including in the church. There's been a lot of holy popes, but also a lot of kind of not so holy popes. And and you see the Holy Spirit working through all of that, right? And to be right there present where it happened, and where Charles V's army came in, and where the Pope had to run into Castel Sant'Angelo, and Catholic armies sacking Catholic cities, and and holy office sometimes, and some of the exaggerations that happened there, and the corruptions in the clergy or among the. I mean, it's just like, okay, but through it all, the Holy Spirit worked, and that just gives us a perspective when things are hard in our own time, and they're not nearly that hard in so many ways. And it's like, oh, we have it easy actually. But going to Rome, you kind of are immersed in that.
Yeah, it really struck me when he said this is where Christ willed that his vicar would live. I mean, his first vicar died there. St. Peter still, his bones are there still under St. Peter's.
Which is an amazing experience, by the way. It's unbelievable.
It really is incredible. Great. Well, thank you so much, Father Carter. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers?
No, this has been great. I'm really grateful for this.
I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.